Welcome to Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. It's like coffee with an analyst, or it could be whiskey with an analyst reading a spreadsheet, linking crime events, identifying a series, and getting the latest scoop on association news and training. So please don't beat that analyst and join us as we define the law enforcement analysis profession one episode at a time.
How we doing, analysts? Jason Elder here with another LEA podcast deep dive, Research Remix with Jamie Roush. Jamie, how we doing?
I'm doing great, Jason. How are you?
I am doing well. You know what I have to do for next time is get a nice little clever tagline there for Research Remix.
That sounds fun.
Realize that I need that nice little tagline that describes applying research best practices to the law enforcement analysis profession.
Yeah, sounds exciting. We'll have to figure that one out.
Yeah. Maybe I have to chat GPT that one because no one thinks anymore.
Absolutely, right? No doubt.
All right, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about reframing the police staffing challenge, and we're going to talk about what the research says about kind of how to address this police staffing issue that we are all facing across the departments. And of course, the main factors of this issue are things like changing demographics in cities, changing demographics in our departments, as well as kind of like these generational preferences of what skills people have and want. And also just the change of people not necessarily being involved in public service. There's also a lot of conversation and topic around police reform and how that's affected the retention of employees and people who are leaving the profession as well. And so really today, there's this whole idea that kind of the rising demand for officers to have these new skills that reflect the diversity of their communities has made it very challenging for agencies to capitalize on this. And so in 2024, Wilson and Gramme draw from a lot of academic and professional literature and some experience that they also have in working with police agencies, where they're really focusing in kind of in this research approach of 4 key goals, which is really understanding the importance of the elements associated with the police staffing system and kind of like the larger ecosystem of police staffing, devising a really good 6-step plan to addressing workforce planning and meeting workload demands, and then understanding how a research systems approach might be the best applied way to address kind of what agencies are facing related to police staffing. So just to kick that off with kind of the first area and talking about a little bit the elements of the police staffing system, one of the things that the researchers have argued here is that most of the most important elements of the police staffing system are really about workload and performance objectives and workforce goals. Things like allocation of personnel, deployment of personnel effectively, recruiting, retention, selection, training, productivity, staffing and succession planning, and then ultimately organizational culture and organizational learning. And all of those things they really talk about are the framework of much broader kind of ecosystem around staffing and staffing related issues. But one of the things that they really argue is that workload, which is the work that police agencies do and can be measured through calls for service, and the amount of time allocated to each call is going to be one of the key areas that departments have the ability to focus in on to address the staffing crises that they're facing. And one of the things that it talks about is that it's not just about understanding what that looks like, but then the allocation of manpower. And today there are kind of 4 methodologies to allocating personnel into a department, or the allocation of personnel for a department, and then ultimately to smaller areas, whether that's your districts, your precincts, your geographic beats, et cetera. But allocation today that they talk about is really per capita. So how many officers do you have per your population? There are allocation models related to minimum staffing, so estimating a sufficient number of patrol officers for being deployed to maintain officer and public safety. Your authorized level, which is something that is coming up in all of the budget talks that we hear all across the country right now. So using budget allocations to specify the number of officers that a department is going to have and how they can allocate those officers. And then ultimately, like I mentioned before, workload-based, which is really the number of officers needed to meet that demand for service. Again, one of the primary objectives of a law enforcement agency is for police officers to respond to citizen issues and understanding what citizens' needs are and that demand for police service. And so again, as we think through this idea of the workload-based approach, I kind of want to bring it to this particular podcast with the fact that workload is an area where analysts have a large role to play. And as we've realized kind of over the years, there are methodologies in how to effectively determine workload for an organization. It requires things like very good quality computer aided dispatch or CAD system data, calls for service. It requires the processes of not only having the dispatch date and time of a call, but also when that officer was en route to that call, when they became on scene in that call, and when they cleared that call, understanding all of those various elements. One of the things we've seen over the years is that you have a dispatch call for service, and then you have essentially that an officer is now en route to that call. And the time between when they're en route to the call and when they're on scene is their travel time. And if the travel time over multiple years is longer, then that also is an indicator potentially that your fuel costs are higher in your budgeting process. So this staffing ecosystem and this workload analysis really allows the organization to see things in a much broader perspective. And so it's really important kind of as people think about workload that they don't just look at how many calls do we have, or even worse, looking at how to allocate staffing based on their actual incidents for call and not necessarily when people are actually going to a particular call that might never get a police report or that might never end up in an arrest. And so these are areas that analysts really have the ability to kind of focus in on and can provide value to their organization in a way that meets these different types of methodologies and standards that are out there, and really can proactively kind of provide value essentially to their organization, even sometimes without the organization understanding or knowing that analysts have access to that data and the ability to do those types of things as well. And so that workload approach really allows an organization to not necessarily look at the staffing crisis in terms of how do we focus in on recruiting and retention, which is often what organizations kind of go at their go-to method for dealing with staffing, but also looking at in that workload, how do we maximize efficiency with the existing staff we have? And where are our opportunities to adjust our deployment, adjust our work schedules to meet maximum efficiency and addressing police service requests? And then ultimately looking at, are there other opportunities for potentially non-sworn staff alternatives to handling those requests for police service that really give people the idea that, essentially it is something that can be handled by the department as a whole from a much larger perspective and not necessarily just through patrol officers or patrol units.
Regarding the staffing crisis, is it just there's less officers than what are on the books? Or is this dealing with stuff like, oh, budgets are shrinking, so they're allowing attrition, so then police departments have to do more with less?
I think it's absolutely both of those. So one of the things that we've seen over the budget talks, probably over the last 6 months or so with different budget cycles, is what is that allocated number from a budgetary perspective that a department has? But then having through the budget process, them looking at the number of vacancies and reducing that authorized number. So what was once 350 officers through that budget process, because they had 20 vacancies, is now 330 officers. And it resets the number of officers that are available in the department to do the work that that department needs to do to service its community. So we're seeing a decrease in the allocation based on the fact that there are vacancies. And the idea is if you can't fill those vacancies, then you don't need them. The other half of that equation is that the other side of the staffing crisis is that recruiting is something today that is becoming more and more and more challenging into public sector work. And so departments, while they may have 3 classes for officers over a year, they're only getting class sizes of 20 or 30 or 40, even in the larger agencies. They're struggling with being able to fill larger classes to fill those vacancies at a fast rate so that those positions are not taken. And so you're seeing the decrease from the budgetary side, both through the vacancies and also just financial constraints, but you're also seeing a shortened period of time for agencies being able to actually recruit and then ultimately fill those vacancies at a rate that's fast enough to meet the attrition that they're experiencing.
So in terms of the class sizes being short, do you know if this is due to, from the very beginning, it being short just with the number of cadets signing up, or is this something they're seeing through the academy process? They're seeing more people drop out as they're going through the process?
I think that's a great question. I think over the last few years or so, we've seen smaller classes generally from the application process, right? And again, a lot of that is generational changes in work and really the demand on police agencies and public sector work. So those classes are ultimately smaller when they start. From my experience in talking with agencies, the washout rate through the academy process is not very much different than it's always been. We're not seeing a faster washout rate, and we're not seeing people who get into the process necessarily and just walk away from it either. It's really more about people who are committed to the process from the very beginning. That number of individuals who are interested in the profession and then get into the actual process is a lot smaller than it's been. And that's still pretty standard across, I would say, a lot of the larger police agencies. There's a few agencies out there that still are being able to have larger classes and graduating larger classes. But by and large, recruiting and retention is something that agencies, no matter the size, are really facing across the profession today.
And then you mentioned workload and analysts' ability to look at workload. And you also mentioned reform, or at least some of the things that police departments are being asked to do. So as that has changed, because I know public health, other departments in the city are being called in sooner, so that not necessarily it's squarely on the shoulder of police departments. But I envision, just because maybe they're taking less public health calls doesn't mean they're just sitting back and twiddling their thumbs all day, right? So they still have plenty to do. And so there's still that aspect of maybe a different type of calls for service and a different response time that analysts can be studying.
Absolutely. So that's one of the things that I think agencies, as they've adopted models of co-responder, that they haven't really necessarily addressed very quickly. And what I mean by that is that when a co-responder model is being adapted, then it does potentially free up other officers or officers who would normally go to those calls to other types of calls. Where I think organizations haven't adapted as quickly is that they're not doing the analysis to understand where are those other calls that those officers should be going and handling, whether that's a specific beat or precinct or district, or whether it's another call type that you can take those skills that those officers had and kind of move them into these other areas. Organizations are not good, policing organizations are not good necessarily at looking across the department and saying, I have all of these resources, where are they best suited today? They often use the same kind of staffing rosters that they've used last year or 2 years before, without making necessarily the changes of understanding that, yes, you now have public health or you have a co-responder that's handling the primary aspect of that call, and it does now free up more time for other officers to go to these other calls. The other factor that comes into this as well is that typically agencies across the board, if they've never done a strong workload analysis and they've never done a true shift relief factor analysis, what ends up happening is they think my officer is contracted for 2,040 hours or 2,080 hours a year, whatever their contract is, and that they're available for police work during that time. That's not accurate, right? We know that officers have court, that they're not necessarily going to be handling a beat. We know that there are officers that have training, mandatory training requirements in the states. That is a number that has to come out. If it's a state that requires any type of breaks, which there are still states that do, those breaks have to come out of that total number. If you ask most agencies, they actually probably have never calculated what their available time is per actual officer. And so what you will find is that typically officers, again, maybe contracted for 2040, 2080 officer 80 hours. But really, when you take all of those requirements out, as well as their benefit leave, they're down somewhere into the 1700, in some cases down to 1500 available hours to actually do police work. Well, that means you have to have more officers to address that. And that's one of the things that calculating that, what that minimum or net annual work hours for an officer for agencies is something that a lot of agencies haven't done. And so they don't understand that when they're doing the workload analysis, you can't base it that an officer has 100% of his or her time. They just don't.
You mentioned the calls for service and the response time. Is there other data sets that analysts should be considering, or maybe other parts of the calls for service or something totally outside of the calls for service data?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to very basic workload analysis, calls for service and CAD data is really kind of the best set of data to start with, because it really does give you what is your total demand for service. And then ultimately, what is your demand in terms of the amount of time on call? And time on call is deceptive. A lot of times people will say, hey, you should remove all the canceled calls out. Well, if you remove the canceled calls and an officer's been dispatched and they've already spent 4.5 minutes en route to that call, that's a time that's been committed, right? They can't handle another call in that 4.5 minutes. And so you don't want to necessarily remove those. And so there's nuances in the calls for service data that I think are important in doing a very strong workload analysis. But then on top of it, as you just kind of alluded to, there are specific data sets based on specific types of calls, right? So if a mental health related call is handled by other units and it's not, and all of the time is not documented specifically in the CAD system, maybe just the officer's time but not the co-responder's time, then you're going to want to bring those data sets in to look at some of these more key types of calls for service. The other thing to look at too is if you're an organization that is doing any type of telephone reporting, automated reporting, online reporting, or even today AI agent chatbot style reporting, you need to understand that that's not going to be captured necessarily in your CAD system. The amount of time of that information is going to be captured in those other systems. And so you want to account for that in your total workload. But again, you're not going to see that necessarily coming for your CAD system. So again, I think from a general standpoint, it's good to start with CAD data. But then as you start really focusing in on what your approach is to handling staffing, maybe it is using non-sworn officers for particular call types, or maybe it is an online reporting, then you have to actually dive in to those different call types, focus in on, okay, what is the amount of time that we're essentially going to free up our officers to handle other things when we move to these approaches. And so there are going to be other data sets that are important as well.
Well, the automated call or the online call that it doesn't go through CAD, as you mentioned, that seems like it would be a hindrance to the workload analysis. Is there a new technology or a new technique as recent that has really helped the workload analysis?
I think really going back probably 20 years, the net annual work hours calculation, which really understands how much time an officer has, is probably like the standard starting point. And then there's a actual methodology out there to calculate shift relief, which basically means how many officers do you need for the amount of time that you're allocated to particular call types, or even to all of your citizen generated calls for service. Those are pretty standard methodologies. But when you get into things like chatbots, AI agents, and things like that, they actually do calculate the amount of time that it took for that call to be completed, essentially, right? So for the time that the person started the chat conversation to the time that that call ended. And what I like about that is that you can use that data to say that's essentially what you've been offsetting for sending an officer, right? So at least generally speaking, if the officer was on scene at that time and completed that call, that's that same time that you're going to see out of these AI agent type of systems. And you can say that's time that we've essentially freed up for officers to be handling other things as well. So it gives you a really good picture, not necessarily to help figure out what your overall workload is and like how you address the staffing side of it. But when you do implement those technologies, it does give you a very good metric to say this is the amount of time that using these systems has essentially freed up our officers to do other things.
Yeah. Now, do you recommend a certain software, or is this more straightforward that an analyst can use? I guess what are some of the tools that an analyst can use?
Yeah, I think in terms of workload overall, it's really important at a very holistic level across your jurisdiction. Just using very simple tools like Excel can give you a lot of the information, do a lot of the calculations for you to get you that complete time on call. I really recommend, though, that you focus in on the geographic side of this as well, because policing by its very nature is very geographic. How officers are deployed using the CAD system is geographic in nature. And that's where essentially bringing in a GIS capability, having all of that stuff mapped and understanding where you have areas that maybe your call response is going to be longer because it's a further out area, or the travel time to get to that location is going to be longer. That is something that you can kind of really see and visualize and help your commanders and your leadership over those geographic areas to address the best way for them to deploy the areas within their geographic boundary. So I really encourage analysts not to just do that first level, which is like how many officers should you have per district across your entire jurisdiction, but then also looking at a deeper level, how do you assign those geographically within each of those districts? And then ultimately start having really good conversations about how do you assign them to the shifts and making sure that your shifts are balanced. That is another area today that organizations usually don't have the capability to really analyze that well, but we'll often find that shift minimums culturally in departments are done based on the way they've always been done, and they don't account for if you've had decreases in your call volume over the last 5 years, or if you've had increases in your call volume. So your shift minimums are set based on kind of like this administrative value, but it may not actually align to when your call demand is. In one particular department that I've worked with, they had actually two different departments, they had shift minimums that were extremely, extremely high into their late shift, their last shift of the day. But actually, in looking at their time on call and looking at the number of units that were actually deployed to those particular calls, so now we're talking 2 car at a time calls or 2 officer deployed calls, they actually were missing a chunk of individuals that they really needed in their mid watch. And so trying to get that organization to shift back and put more officers in that second watch rather than in the third watch is something that you have to work through as well. Again, sometimes organizations will do that over attrition, and sometimes they'll make those whole scale changes as part of their contract or their yearly staffing changes that they make. But those are areas where, again, it's not necessarily just about geography, but now it's down to making sure that you're deploying your officers effectively across the shifts.
Now, are you seeing anything where in practice the workload analysis isn't necessarily following what you're reading in the research?
No, I don't necessarily think that there's anything that's not aligned with the research. I mean,
Mhm.
the research is pretty straightforward about the fact that the workload analysis and the workload-based approach is really the best method to address kind of efficiency of the department, but then also looking at how do we kind of address this staffing crisis, given the fact that sometimes we can't control recruitment, we can't control training, we can't control retention at a very holistic level, but we can control where our officers are deployed and how they're deployed and ensuring that they're meeting where the community's demand is for their service. And so the research really kind of aligns it to saying, yes, this approach is the right approach of doing it. And it really, while departments have not focused on that approach as a method of addressing policing staffing, it needs to be focused on more. And there is a role that analysts play in that type of analysis that then allows the organization to kind of address its staffing challenges more holistically and gradually, rather than just saying we have to get more people in the door.
Yeah. And for the listeners, we'll put links in the show notes for additional information on all the research that we've discussed today. All right, Jamie, just to finish up, let's just give them a nice research remix, one-liners to just summarize what we've talked about here today.
Yeah, so law enforcement organizations are definitely facing a lot of challenges with staffing. And one of the ways to really address that the research focuses in on is, while organizations have not focused in on workload-based approaches and looking at workload analysis and ultimately the role that analysts play in that, essentially that is an area where they can capitalize quickly. So I encourage all of the analysts out there who are listening, if you're not familiar with these approaches, There are methodologies out there for it, and really start diving into some of these approaches. You may be able to help your organization proactively in a way that they didn't know that you could help them.
Always appreciate your time and perspective, Jamie. Thank you so much, and you be safe.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for making it to the end of another episode of Analyst Talk with Jason Elder. You can show your support by sharing this and other episodes found on our website at www.leapodcasts.com. If you have a topic you would like us to cover or have a suggestion for our next guest, please send us an email at leapodcasts@gmail.com. Till next time, analysts, keep talking.